In our previous video, we reviewed different types of connections in language, focusing specifically on the subordinating connectors and the different types of dependent clauses they help connect. The three types of dependent clauses are adjective clauses, noun clauses, and adverb clauses. We learned that these clauses connect to the independent, or sometimes called main clause, but they are not grammatically complete ideas by themselves. One reason is that the clause also contains the subordinating connector as part of the clause. These dependent clauses connect to the independent clause by functioning as a part of speech. So let's look a little more carefully by looking at our first portrait here of adjective clauses. Now, unlike regular adjectives, adjective clauses go after the noun they describe. So, for example, if you had an adjective before, let's say, the subject of a sentence, when you introduce an adjective clause, the adjective clause would come after the noun, not before it. Now, like any clause, adjective clauses do contain their own verb, which we would generally call a dependent verb, but they often do not contain a dependent subject. Now, of course, this is not always the case, but it is often the case. And that's because the noun from the independent clause would also be the subject of the dependent clause in these particular cases. So, for example, look at this situation. The student who is sitting next to the door is very smart. So again, in this case, we have an adjective clause that's connecting by a subordinating connector, which in this case is the word who, and then followed by a dependent predicate situation. So remember, in this case, the subject of the adjective clause will most likely be a noun that we see in the independent clause. So this is how these two particular clauses will connect to each other. Now again, this is not always the case. So in later videos, we'll look and see how adjective clauses can connect in another way. But in this case, it's, again, pretty common that we're describing the person before directly. Okay, now let's look at noun clauses. Again, noun clauses can go where regular nouns can go, specifically in these locations, as the subject of a predicate independent idea, as the object in the predicate, and of course we can see them also as the objects of prepositions, but we're only going to focus on these two here. Noun clauses, though, do contain a subordinating connector, a dependent subject, and a dependent predicate. So, for example, here's one where it's the subject of the independent clause. What the problem is doesn't concern me. So again, notice its construction. We have our subordinating connector, we have a dependent subject, and we do have a predicate, or in this case, just a simple verb. Here's one where the noun clause is the object of the independent clause. I don't know what you were talking about. Again, same construction. You've got a connector, and then you have a subject and dependent predicate. Finally, adverb clauses go where regular adverbs can go, usually those that modify the verb. Now, of course, this is not always the case, but usually. They generally can be found at the beginning or the end of the independent clause. So, for example, one thing we notice is if we can have an adverb clause at the beginning, generally we separate them with a comma. If the adverb clause is at the end of the sentence, it does not need to be separated with a comma most of the time. So, for example, when we have it at the beginning of the independent clause, when it is raining, comma, we can't play basketball outside. So in this case, again, notice how we're separating the idea, and notice how it's constructed. We have our connector, subject, and predicate. And again, these are all referred to as dependent subject and dependent predicate. If we moved it to the end of the sentence, notice it's fairly simple and straightforward. Again, no comma to separate them. So in this case, it follows basically the same ideas. Subordinating connector with the subject and a predicate. Just to remind everybody at this point, dependent clauses are not considered to be grammatically complete. Again, remember, the idea is they're connecting as parts of speech. So if we tried to use them by themselves, Even though they often contain their own subjects and predicates, they are not considered to be complete grammatical ideas. So again, if you look at these examples, if I separated out all of the dependent clauses we identified in the video, notice how these don't make sense by themselves. When it is raining. Who is sitting next to the door? What are you talking about? So these particular ideas don't make sense by themselves. What the problem is. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind. Even though we are introducing more subjects and predicate situations into a sentence, that connector right there really is what helps determine whether it's going to be a dependent clause or not. Now, let's start with an interesting question. What exactly do adjectives do? So if we think about them in general, we would say, or you could find in most textbooks, that they describe or modify nouns. But what exactly does that mean, to modify something? Well, one way to think about it involves the idea of change or alter. For example, let's think about a wheelbarrow. If I said a wheelbarrow, this really could be any wheelbarrow. And so whatever image comes to mind would pretty much be your idea of a wheelbarrow. But notice when I add an adjective, suddenly how much more specific the idea becomes. What if I said a red wheelbarrow? Now we've created an image that's slightly more specific. And in fact, if I said red wheelbarrow, you might have likely have had this particular picture in mind. So if we think about it, adjectives help to make ideas more specific, which means in a way that in actuality they help limit or restrict the idea they're describing. Now, the idea of a red wheelbarrow tells us a couple of things. First, that the wheelbarrow is red and not some other color, and that it's a red wheelbarrow, not some other red device, or any other device for that matter. So, the more adjectives we add to the noun idea here, the more specific it becomes, and thus more restricted. So, for example, if I said it's a new big red wheelbarrow, it's not just a red one, now it's big, and of course now it's new. So adjectives, in a way, help to restrict or limit information in a particular way. Now, let's extend the idea to adjective clauses. Since adjective clauses function very much like adjectives, they can also restrict nouns by giving even more information about them than even regular adjectives can. I mean, think about it. If I said in a general sentence, the man is smart, now, this is perhaps a grammatically acceptable sentence, but it's fairly general. And really, we would have to understand the context here because, of course, first off, we don't know who we're talking about, which man. But notice the moment we add an adjective clause, one that defines the man, who exactly are we talking about? Notice it becomes much more specific. Now it's not just any man, but specifically the one we see next to the door. So the adjective clause in the second example gives us a much more specific, or what we would refer to as restrictive idea, in which we have a much clearer idea about whom we are speaking. Now, in the sense here, adjective clauses have another advantage. Other than just giving more information than adjectives, they can also give something that perhaps is a little bit different in the sense that it can also give information that's not necessary or restrictive. So look at these examples. So we take our original example, and then notice how we changed it a little bit. So instead of saying the man, now we say Joe. Now one thing you probably noticed right away is not only have we changed the person, or changed the idea, but we've also added commas. So how are they different? Well, in the first example, we don't know exactly which man we're talking about. So in this case, the information in the adjective clause is what we refer to as necessary. It's there to help us. In the second example, since we already know this person, so again, maybe you're talking to a friend, and if you said Joe, the person would know exactly who you're talking about. So in this case, since we know the name of the person, the fact that he is sitting next to the door might be helpful, but it's not grammatically essential to the meaning of the sentence. In other words, if I removed this phrase, or this clause, if I said Joe is smart, then the fact that he's sitting next to the door doesn't really affect that. It's just extra information. So again, what we're talking about here is the difference between using adjective clauses in a restrictive or non-restrictive way. Now, different textbooks will call these different things. For example, some textbooks call them necessary or essential information, or non-essential or not necessary information. But we're going to continue using the words restrictive and non-restrictive. So again, restrictive information is information that's necessary for the overall grammatical meaning of the independent clause. In other words, the adjective clause is necessary to help define or restrict something that's in the independent clause. And of course, this clause is not separated from the independent clause with any punctuation. Non-restrictive clauses, though, are considered helpful or extra, but not grammatically necessary. So again, if you see someone who has put 2 commas in the sentence, or perhaps 1, depending on its placement, the person is trying to tell you that the information is not considered grammatically necessary. So again, commas, whether it's 1 comma if the adjective clause is at the end of the sentence, or a set of commas, which we also refer to as paired commas, if the clause is in the middle of the sentence. So let's look at these examples. Can you identify if they're restrictive or non-restrictive? Let's take a look at the first example. The Hawaiian Islands, which comprise 8 major and 124 minor islands, became the 50th state in 1959. Okay, well, first off, let's pull out our red pen tool and see if we can identify some important pieces of information. First off, we notice that the noun, the Hawaiian Islands, has already been identified for us. So we've already pretty much defined what the idea is. So this information that follows, it describes the Hawaiian Islands, but is it necessary for the overall meaning of the sentence? In this case, probably not. It's helpful information, but not grammatically essential to distinguish the Hawaiian Islands from a different set of Hawaiian Islands. Another thing that will also help us here is the fact that we do see those paired commas. So in this case, what we have is information that we would consider to be non-restrictive. Okay, let's try our next one. Students who work more than 12 hours a week should not take more than 3 classes. Now, in this case, we notice that students is a fairly general word and could be defined many different ways. So if I removed this clause for a moment, so just imagine if we removed it, you would have students should not take more than 3 classes. Well, that's a pretty big sentence because we could be talking about many different kinds of students. Are we talking about all of the students here at this school? Probably not. So in this case, the information that follows that describes the word students, most likely we need this information to help qualify or define which students we're talking about. Again, notice there are no commas here to separate the information, so most likely this is going to be a restrictive situation. Okay, let's look at our next final example here on this screen. Roberto lives in an apartment that overlooks the Pacific Ocean. Now you notice Roberto in this case is not the person we're defining. It's actually the word apartment. So the first question is it just any apartment? Well, if I remove the clause, that's exactly what it looks like. Roberto lives in an apartment. So in this case, we probably do need more information. What kind of apartment, or where is it? So even though this particular clause defines the word apartment, it does seem to be grammatically necessary for the sentence. So in this case, we're also going to say this is a restrictive situation. Okay, now we got 2 more, and I'm actually going to bring them both up at the same time, because if you notice, they have exactly the same words, but one is slightly different from the other. Let's see if you can identify how they're different. So take a moment and look at the screen. Do you see the difference? In the first example, we have commas. In the second example, no commas. So hopefully by now you've recognized that the first example would be considered not restrictive, and the second example would be. Now the question, of course, is, if both of these sentences could be possible, then how do they differ in meaning? Well, let's look at the next screen and figure out how exactly are they different. So in the first example, the one that uses the double commas or the paired commas, notice how this information is not restricting the group. So in other words, when I say the students passed the exam, I'm referring to all of the students in this class or group. So again, as this is a non-restrictive situation, it applies to everybody, not a special few. But when we change the sentence and remove the commas, now we notice it's not just any student, it's specifically the students who studied all night. So in this case, we want to distinguish this group from other people who did not pass the test. So now we're actually creating two different groups, those who passed, or those who studied all night, and those who probably didn't. And in this case, those who studied all night passed the exam, whereas those who didn't study probably did not pass. So in this case, what you're doing is you're making this group a more specific group within a larger group. So again, for example, this circle represents the larger group. This group might represent only a small part or perhaps even half, depending on how big the group is. So in this case, what you're doing in the second example is probably creating two different groups, those who studied, those who didn't. Now, a unique feature of dependent clauses is that they can often be reduced in length in order to create a more direct relationship. Now, the most common reductions occur in these following situations. First off, let's talk about adjective clauses and go back to our original example of the student who's sitting next to the door. So notice we have our typical adjective clause following the noun it's describing. One key thing to notice, though, is the voice of the verb. The voice of the verb in this situation is what we refer to as active voice. In other words, the student, if you recall, the student is also the subject of the verb in this part. So in other words, this person is doing this particular action. So yes, it's an active voice verb, and it's also in the present progressive. Now that's very important because watch what happens. Now we've created what we would call an adjective phrase. It's a participial adjective phrase. It's a participial phrase because sitting is a participle form, ing. So in this case, what we did is we made some slight changes, but we left the progressive participle in the sentence. We still have an idea that's describing the word student, though. So notice how we removed the subordinated connector and the helping verb to create what we would call an ing, active voice, participial adjective phrase. And yes, that's a very long expression. Many textbooks might just refer to it as an ing adjective phrase. Now, watch what happens, though, when we change the verb into the passive voice. So in this case, the car which is parked outside is mine. Notice we kept the ed participle and reduced it to an adjective phrase, but specifically one that is a passive voice. In other words, we kept the participle, even though it's still describing the word car. In this case, we removed the subordinating connector and the helping verb and created an ed passive voice participial adjective phrase. And again, textbooks will often refer to it as just an ed adjective phrase. So in comparing the two, as we said before, ing participial phrases are known as active voice. In order to create a reduced adjective phrase, you generally take either a progressive tense verb and eliminate the subordinate connector and the helping verb. So in other words, you leave the ing participle. Now, in the next screen, you will see that you can also change most active voice verbs into ing adjective phrases, and we'll show you more in just a moment. Ed participial adjective phrases are known generally as passive voice participial adjectives. And again, in order to create that reduced adjective phrase, basically you can use only verbs that are already in the passive voice. And then you would eliminate the subordinate connector and the helping verb. Now, as we said before, you can change an active voice verb into an ing participle. Watch what happens. For example, anyone who plans to travel in the tropics should know about malaria. The Smiths, who will leave next week for the Amazon, got some malaria pills from the doctor. Mr. Smith, who believed malaria was a disease of the past, didn't take the pills. Now again, notice how all of these are in the active voice. And of course, notice that one's in the present, one is in the future, and one here is in the simple past. Now again, remember, don't confuse past and passive. This last example is not a passive voice. It is an active voice verb. It's just in the past tense. Now, watch what happens when we want to put them into an ing participle. In other words, we want to reduce the situation. Now notice what we have. Plans becomes planning. We eliminated the connector, and now we have the participle. Leave becomes leaving. Will leave becomes leaving. And believed in the past tense becomes believing, ing. So again, in all three of these cases, we've taken the active voice verb and created an ing participle adjective. Now, there are times when you can't reduce adjective clauses. For example, when the subordinate connector is when or where. So notice in these particular situations, we generally can't eliminate the adjective clause. Now, of course, there's another difference too. If you notice, in this situation here, we're describing the word plays. And even in this second part here in the clause, we have another subject, the word everyone. This is something we're going to talk a little bit more about in a future video. But notice we couldn't remove the connector and the subject from this and have it still make sense. You couldn't say, I like to go to a place knows my name. That doesn't make any sense. Here's another situation that follows kind of the same idea. When you have the word when, using as an adjective situation, and again we do have another subject here as well. So the year 1979 was a time when the American economy was doing poorly. You couldn't remove the connector and the subject as well and still have it make sense. So in this case, these are two situations where you couldn't reduce. So again, that subordinate connector is necessary. Now let's talk about adverb clauses. And again, adverb clauses look pretty simple, but there are several things we have to remember. So first off, keep in mind that these things can happen only in these situations. First off, when the clause itself is discussing the ideas of when or why some action is taking place. Also, you have to remember when the subject of both parts, of both the dependent clause and the independent clause, are referring to the same person. And again, this is a situation where many, even native English speakers, get confused. Now, you can eliminate the subordinate connectors of why, but you need to keep the connectors of when. So again, depending on the situation, as you will see in these next few examples, you have to kind of determine, are we asking a why situation or is it a when situation? And you'll see what happens to the subordinate connectors of each one. Finally, again, things to keep in mind, the active voice verbs change to ing participles. Passive voice keep that ed participle or whatever past participle is being used. So for example, let's take a look at these sentences and watch how we change them. When I speak on the telephone, I try to speak slowly and clearly. Some students like to listen to music while they are doing homework. When he was questioned by the police, the murderer confessed to his crime. Because I needed a quiet place to study, I often yelled at my noisy siblings. After I had yelled at them, however, I always feel guilty. Now again, I've highlighted the particular clause in question. So again, watch what happens. In our first example, since it was an active voice situation, and since it's a time situation, we generally want to keep the time connector, if you recall, and notice we changed it to speaking. So while speaking on the telephone. Now again, this is where a lot of English speakers get confused, because oftentimes they're not sure if the subject of the next part really is referring to the subject of the first part. And so what you often have many times are adverb clause situations where the the clause is actually modifying the wrong person's action. So we will talk more about this when we talk in a future video about sort of common mistakes that English speakers and English students can make. Again, second example here, another time situation. Notice we, again, have changed the verb to doing. Same thing again, we kept when, but then we kept the past participle, so when questioned. Now, in this second to last example, though, the original idea had because. So, in this situation, we can remove the word because, but notice we did have to make some changes. We did have to put the verb into an active voice participle, so an ing. And again, it's still referring to the person, the subject of the next part. Finally, we had to keep the time connector again, but then we reduced it to the word yelling. So again, notice the reductions in these situations sometimes involved removing the connector and the subject. Sometimes it just removed the subject and made a few changes to the verb itself. So like in this ing situation, and of course again it's referring back to the person who's doing the action. Now, noun phrases are created essentially to create an idea that we call an appositive. And an appositive basically is a noun or noun phrase that restates or renames another noun or noun phrase. So let's see what appositives can be. Appositives can be a reduced adjective phrase that actually uses a noun complement in its original form. So we'll take a look at that in just a moment. And it also can be restrictive or non-restrictive. And again, we'll look at a couple of examples. Now, notice in this situation here, we have an adjective phrase. We're defining and describing the word golf. So notice it's a non-restrictive situation. So even young women are learning to play golf, which was traditionally a man's sport. Now, in this case, again, since we have a to-be verb, we're actually just going to eliminate the to-be verb altogether. And we're also going to eliminate the connector. So in this particular adjective clause, the verb is going to be key, because notice the verb is a state of being verb. So this is a situation we would refer to as a predicate nominative, in which it's a state of being verb, but then it has a noun complement, which was a sport. Golf was a sport, and specifically a man's sport. So notice what happens. As we said before, we eliminate the connector, but we also eliminate that to be verb. And now we've created an appositive phrase. Notice it's still non-restrictive because we've kept the comma. So in this case, the original adjective clause contained a noun complement. So that makes it much easier to reduce. Now, here are some simpler appositive phrases, and again, they could have been longer adjective clauses. Certainly, you'll notice it's in the location of where an adjective clause might be, but we're just going to go to a simpler situation, one that you're probably more familiar with when we use people's names. So, in this case, notice we have basketball star LeBron James plays for the Miami Heat. Now, this is, again, an appositive phrase, because LeBron James, of course, is two words. But it is restrictive. In other words, we didn't separate it with commas. Now, the reason is, of course, is that we need the person's name in order to understand which basketball star we're talking about. So there are many basketball players for the team. Which one are we talking about? So we need this restated information. And again, remember that this was most likely an adjective clause before, but it's referring basically to the same person, basketball star and LeBron James. Now watch what happens though when we switch it around. We still have an appositive phrase, but this time the situation is non-restrictive. Because we know, or at least in this context, we think that most people would know that LeBron James is a basketball star. So we can probably also reasonably guess that he's a basketball player because the Miami Heat is a basketball team. Now, of course, that means you have to understand the context very well. Finally, in today's video, we talked about the fact in our previous video that we were going to evaluate the different sentence patterns we have. Because now that we've looked at these basic patterns, we kind of need to understand how they all work together. Now, first off, we identified these three basic sentence patterns. Simple sentences, which just involve one independent clause. Compound sentences, which involve two or more independent clauses. And again, those are connected by those conjunctions, those coordinating conjunctions that we learned about in the first two videos. And then for the last couple of videos, we've been talking about complex sentences, which means that there's at least one dependent clause somewhere in the sentence. Now, of course, what happens when you combine the middle two or the last two ideas? In other words, you have a compound sentence in which one or more of the independent clauses also contains a complex idea. Well, you create an idea that seems fairly simple enough, a complex compound sentence. So how exactly does that work? Well, look at this example here. I've highlighted some information to kind of show you. But first off, the key is to recognize, like we said in our first video, the key is to recognize the connections. So first off, you will notice that I see a subordinating connector, the word which. But then I also see a conjunction, the word and. So the first discussion is, well, which one is going to be more important? Which one is going to determine the basic nature of this sentence? Well, again, even though it does contain a complex idea, it is still first a compound idea. And that's usually because if it's compound, it's going to contain at least two independent ideas. Well, again, notice for a moment. Let's ignore the part in purple, and notice the part that's kind of in this gray here. The first baskets were peach baskets, and the first basketballs were soccer balls. So notice in this case we do have a subject, and we do have a verb. And again, as we move down to basketballs, we have another subject and another verb. But the two ideas do not depend on each other. And we know that because the connector and is essentially adding more information. So to be more specific, what we have here is a subject and a verb of one independent clause. And we have the subject and verb of another independent clause. So in other words, we have two independent clauses going on here. So yes, the first thing to think about is that this is truly a compound sentence. But it also happens to contain a complex idea. And that's where the word which comes in. Because what it does is it helps connect to the idea of peach baskets. So this part here really belongs to the first independent idea. And again, is functioning like an adjective. So in this situation, in order to evaluate the patterns we have, it's still very important to look for the connectors. But when we see these particular ideas together, the first thing we need to recognize is that there are two independent ideas in the sentence. So, thus, the compound complex sentence. So remember, the dependent clause is attaching itself to at least one independent clause. And again, even though it is adding another verb and sometimes another subject to the sentence, remember, these ideas are not part of the main idea. That's why we often refer to them as the dependent verb and the dependent subject. And we'll be referring to that as to those in future videos. And remember, the subordinate connector usually belongs to the dependent clause. Now, of course, in this video we've been talking about reducing clauses, but still the basic idea is that they depend on the main ideas of the sentence. So let's look at these examples. Can you identify the sentence pattern? If people want to bring beer or wine, they can bring their own. I suggest that we also have snacks like chips and nuts and maybe some fruit. When I call the guests, I'll ask each of them to bring something, and maybe we can order some pizza to have as well. Now look at all three examples and see if you can identify which one is a simple sentence, which one is a complex, which one is compound, and do we have one that might be compound and complex? Well, let's look a little more carefully now. So again, in our first example, I've identified here the clause in purple, and again, the idea here is, what is it doing? Well, if we look carefully, we can see, first off, it's at the beginning of the sentence. It seems to be separated by a comma. There does seem to be another subject and other verb. So far it looks like it might be an independent idea, but then we notice that there is the word if, and that's why I highlighted it in purple, because this is not an independent clause, this is a dependent clause. And specifically, this is an adverb clause, because it's describing a situation. It's describing a particular case or condition. In the second part, we have a subject and verb, but they are the main subject and main verb of the sentence. So in this case, what we've created is a complex sentence. Now in our next example, it's even more tricky, because if you notice here, again, I've highlighted a particular idea because of that connector that. So already that should tell you something, that this is most likely a dependent idea. Now, if you think about it, well, we've got conjunctions here. We have and in both situations. How come this is not a complex compound idea? Well, that's because they're not connecting to anything that's complete after it. See, notice this last part here, maybe some fruit, is not actually a complete idea either. There's no subject, there's no verb here. So in this case, these particular conjunctions are actually making a series of ideas, or a list. So notice we have a list of chips, nuts, and fruit. So remember, that's something else that conjunctions can do. They can also help create a series or list of things. Now, maybe we don't need the second and. Maybe we only need this, the first and. We only need the second and. But in this case, the idea is that everything belongs to the dependent clause. And specifically, this would be a noun-dependent clause, because I suggest would indicate that this is the object of that dependent clause. So in this case, we have another complex sentence. So that was a little tricky there. All right, in our final example, again, we've highlighted a particular clause, and that's because you'll notice there's the connector, when, and there's that comma to separate them. So it appears that this would be a complex idea, but I do see the word and again. Now the question is, how do we know this one is different from the one before it? Well, part of the idea is, what is it connecting? If we follow along, we can see that there's another subject and another verb here. And notice there are no other subordinate connectors. So what we have here is essentially two independent ideas, one here and one here. So in this case, we have that complex compound or compound complex idea, in which case the compound idea is the most important, and then the complex part is really just part of the independent idea at the beginning. And we can kind of separate them all together using these little brackets. So remember, as we said from the very first video, where do these ideas begin and where do these ideas end? And it's all about the connections. We learned that dependent clauses are almost always introduced with subordinate connectors, and we detailed those in the second video, but clearly there are several more that you need to study. They act as parts of speech, specifically nouns, adjectives, and adverbs. They add another verb to the sentence, and often another subject, but they are not complete ideas by themselves. Remember, they're called dependent verbs and subjects. And they can be reduced to create dependent phrases, including those ing or active voice adjective phrases, the ed passive voice adjective phrases, appositives, which again are noun phrases that are most likely created from reduced adjective clauses with noun complements, and then finally those reduced adverb phrases. In our next video, we will look at various situations involving word order, including question formation, adverb placement, and direct-indirect objects, among others. Thanks for watching.